Okay, I'm going to start by recalling briefly what was said in the first meeting. So for the people that were there should not be a new thing, and for people that were not this meeting, at least you know what it was about. It was on exploitation and profit, and the main point that was made was that the workers and the capitalism are the sole creator of wealth, and that the capitalists pump out the surplus value out of the workers, and it's through this exploitation that they manage to get profit. And basically that, if you don't have exploitation, you have no profit. And it was also showed that, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation because I'm not very good at that, so I'll use the good old whiteboard. But basically it was shown that to produce a commodity, like what you need two things. You need workers, and you need to equip them with some kind of means of production. So in other words, you have living labor, which is your workers, the people, and you equip them with means of production, which are called dead labor. And through this, you'll produce a commodity, and once you sell it, you're going to get profit. Well, that's the sign. I studied economics, so that's what we use. But it's also called the surplus value in Marxist terminology. And it was also explained that, this living labor, you can call it, not that one, variable capital, so that, it expands the wealth and it creates the wealth. And then the dead labor is also called constant capital because, it doesn't obtain the wealth value, it just transfers it. And so the first meeting, what it showed was that, through a system of exploitation, from capital, you basically get some surplus value. So through a system of exploitation. What I'm going to look at in this meeting, it's another process, is how through the surplus value, you create capital via a process called accumulation. And the main claim, that Marx made was basically that capitalists will be accumulating a lot more dead labor at the expense of living labor, and thereby they will undermine their own profitability. So this is basically the main argument. And obviously, this is an introductory course to Marxist economics, so I assume that most people are not that familiar with Marxist economics. For those who are, well, it's always good to go back to basics, and for those who are not, I hope that you can leave this room, understanding a little bit more about accumulation, though you'll probably have to go and read it as well yourself. So I'm going to structure this meeting in basically three main parts. The first part will look at one aspect of capitalism, mainly that it's a production which is made for exchange. And I will introduce in this part the general formula of capital. In the second part, I'm going to look at a second feature of capitalism. Mainly, there's a system of competitive accumulation. So that's when I'm going to look at the role of competition and the imperatives it creates. And in the third part, I'm going to look at the broader implication of what that means. So obviously, mainly that it makes the system very dynamic, but also leads to the system being very prone to crisis. And that's when I'm going to just quickly touch upon what the rate of profit is. But all of this, will be dealt with as well in the third meeting in this series. So that's the structure of it. So we have to recall that capitalism is the first system in human history that revolves around producing goods for the market. So that means that everything that we consume, whether it's tea, shoes, whatever you can think of, is a result of a purchasing act on the market. And prior to capitalism, what you had is basically a production that was for use value. So that means that basically you produce what you consume. Ooh, positive. So, you had peasants, they had their lands, they grew their own crops, they would make their own clothes, they would build their own shelter, and, they had direct access to the means of life, to the means of production. And this was changed, obviously with the emergence of capitalism, which obviously was not, a very peaceful process, not at all. That's, peasants were really forced out of their land. They were dispossessed. In Britain, there was the enclosures that you might have heard of. The lands were privatized, and the means of production were also privatized and in the hands of just a few people. And so from this, it basically means that, you had no other choice. You had to enter market exchange. And that means, to meet your basic needs. And so now we're all market dependent. You have no other choice, whether for housing or anything, you have to go via the market. So that doesn't mean that there was no market before the emergence of capitalism. There was, but that was more of a peripheral thing. With capitalism, the market became, the regulator of so-called well-being or, of our daily life. And consequently, that means that you get what you pay for, not necessarily what you need. And so because, production is undertaken for exchange, that also means that as a capitalist, you don't give a damn about, how useful things are, about their use value, about their utility, what they are for, their quality. It doesn't matter. What you need, what you care about is the exchange value, is that you can, make money out of it. So in Marx terminology, it is the exchange value rather than the use value of goods that ultimately matters for capital. Once again, what matters for capital is a purely abstract property of a commodity, is its capacity to turn into profit in surplus value. And so there's this Canadian, an investment manager, and he described with a sentence really well how what capitalism is about, which I'm sure Marx will be very happy with his definition. And he said, a business doesn't have any feelings, its DNA is to make money. And that will be made clear what that is. So Marx basically expressed this to this formula, this M prime, money, commodity, money. And this describes basically the business cycle, how a business operates. So that means that as a capitalist, you start with money in your pocket. Not like you or me, the capitalists do start with money in their pocket. And then they are going to use this money in order to get, their living labor, the day labor together, in order to produce a commodity. And then they're going to sell this commodity in order to make profit, hence the prime. Because there is no point, for the capitalist to do an MCM, you need to make a profit out of it, right? There's always, this is basically the goal of capitalist production. And so what matters really is not how individual capitalists really behave. What really matters is you have to understand that this is what they have to do. They need to be constantly looking for sums of expendable wealth, M prime. So the goal of a capitalist production is basically the drive to accumulate more wealth. And so that means that, how can you do that? Of course you can produce jeans or bread, but you can also produce bombs, or tear gases, which, I'm sure that if you've been on protests, the use value is very useful in order to calm down protesters. And so it also doesn't matter, how nutritive your food can be or anything of that. We can sell you things that will cause you cancer. Doesn't matter, because the aim, once again, is to get this M prime. And so I don't know if you remember the scandal that was around the breast implant, the PIP breast implant in France, They used basically, substandard silicone gel. It can damage, women had to have their breast implant removed, it could have killed them or whatever. Not a problem, right? What you need is more wealth. And there was also, for example, in Japan, you have, because obviously we pollute a lot, our planet and stuff. And so in Japan, what they do, they have a bottle of air. So they go in the countryside, and they package, some very pure air, and then, they come back, and so when you're in the city, comes some fresh air. I mean, it's absolutely insane, but this is, what happens. And I'm sure you have a lot of examples of things, that you can think of. And that's why, there's no ethical consideration whatsoever. And there is no environmental consideration either. So, we pollute our sea, we destroy the ozone, we have an economy that, is based on burning fossil fuel, it leads to global warming, but once again, who cares? You can make money out of it. So now, again in Japan, I don't know if there's any Japanese people here, I'm not trying to attack Japan at all, but in Japan now, they're actually building, more nuclear, they're reopening the Ohi nuclear plant. And there's a lot of protests, against that, because people are like, hey, remember Fukushima and stuff? No, we don't, we're going to continue reopening places, nuclear plant in spaces where there can be earthquake, that only a capitalist could come up with that, like any person with sensible mind would think, oh, that could be dangerous, but it doesn't matter, like radioactivity, children dying, all of that, not a problem. And that's not just, about, when you produce commodity that this happens. It's the same in the financial sector as well. So for instance, with financial assets, like mortgage-backed securities, does it matter how toxic they are? No. Actually, the more toxic they are, the better it is. So, you still have this, always this drive to get more M. Of course, in the financial sector, you don't have, this bit. You always try to go straight from the M to the M prime, and it appears that magically, you create some money. And the M, so it doesn't really matter, what capital we're talking about, whether it's productive, financial, whatever. This is the general formula that is going to follow. This, always for more money. And once again, it's not, for Marx, what's important is not what capitalists do, but what drives them to do the things they do. What processes are behind, what pushes them to, to behave, like greedy bastard. In some respect, because it's true, you'll hear a lot about human, they're just greedy, and it's human nature, or it's the animal spirit of the entrepreneurs, and they're just bad, and they just want more, etc., etc. I'm not denying that. If you look, for example, what's his face, Bob Diamond. Bob Diamond, for 21 million pound a year salary, and now he was forced to go away, and okay, let's grab another 20 million, as a payoff. I get you, Bob Diamond is a greedy one, that's for sure, and many of them are probably greedy. But what Marx wants to show is that actually they're not so free of their action. It's not as if they can afford, in a way, not to behave the way they do. So it's not a choice, it's a necessity. And it's a necessity because the drive to accumulate is really at the heart of the system. And so Marx wrote that the development of capitalist production makes it constantly necessary to keep increasing the amount of capital laid out. And to fulfill their role as a capitalist, they must accumulate. So now we're getting into the second part of this meeting, which is about that capitalism is a system of competitive accumulation. So what is it, accumulation? Because I don't want you to go away without understanding what accumulation per se is. So accumulation is a very simple concept. It's basically that as a capitalist, you're going to take some of your surplus value and you're going to put it back into production. And you're going to create more capital. That is what accumulation is about. So Marx likes to do that, he likes to first, look at the basic things and then going into what's complex about it. So we're not going to go too deeply about what's complex about it, but we're going to stick to the basics in this meeting. But the real question again is, why are capitalists forced to accumulate? And the answer is because we live in a competitive environment. So in capitalist society, you have two main divisions, right? So you have one in between the workers and the capitalists, quite obvious one, that I'm not going to get into. And the second one is that capitalists are also, against other capitalists. Because it's not as if, they're all together, being like, oh, how are we going to all make profit, etc. No. It's very anarchical. There's no, planning, no coordination whatsoever. You are constantly competing with other capitalists. So if you, each owner of a bakery, each CEO of a steel mill, whatever you can think of, they're all competing with many others. So you have Gap that competes with H&M, Starbucks with Costa, Pizza Hut and Domino's, and you can go on and on and on. And so they're always competing. And what they need to do in order to be, they need to sell their product, right? Because if you don't sell your product, you don't have any profit. So they have to constantly, compete with other capitalists in order to, secure their sales. So how do you compete, basically? So Marx said that, like, first and foremost is by cheapening your commodities. So you want to maximize the amount of surplus value that you make, of profit, but you want to minimize, this part here. So Marx said the battle of competition is fought by cheapening of commodities. And the cheapness of commodities depends on the productivity of labor. So basically, in order to cheapen your commodities, you need to extend the productive powers of labor. And this is done, mainly by investing into new technology. And what Marx says is that, by increasing your productivity, you do that by increasing the organic composition of capital. Do not get scared. I'll explain more, what it's about in a minute. But that's basically what he says. So for a company, in order to produce your good very quickly and very cheaply, what you need to do is to become more productive. So obviously, there's two things that as capitalists you can do, right? So for example, if I'm the owner of a jean industry like Levi's, what I can do, so I have my textile workers, and they have, I give them some fabric and sewing machine, and they'll give me my pair of jeans at the end. So what can I do? I can make them, work faster, of course, right? So Marx called that increasing the absolute value, surplus value. But this has limitation, right? Or because we're people, we can actually say, hey, we're not going to put up with this crap, or you're people, you need to sleep, so that's not the best thing that you can do as a capitalist. The best thing that you can do is to invest in machinery, new technology, because machines, they don't complain, they're not like us, so it's pretty great. So that means increasing what Marx called the relative surplus value. And because you have to do that, that means that you constantly need to have parts of your surplus value all the time injected back into mainly, accumulating dead labor or constant capital. So once again, if you don't do that, you can say goodbye to your business. That's it. The competition will take over whatever you're out. Well, that's the main thing. So once again, it's not by choice that capitalists do that. It's really by necessity. They have to reinvest constantly in order to remain competitive. So once again, capitalism is not just a system of commodity production, it's also a system of competitive accumulation. And that's why, when people think, you could have an ethical capitalist or a friendly boss and all of that. No, you can't. It's not possible. Even if they would want to be nice, I'm sure some of them can be nice, but they can't afford to be nice. They can't afford not to exploit you, and they can't afford not to constantly invest in means of production. So you can't have, if you want to be an ethical capitalist, then you have to stop being a capitalist. It's as simple as that. So all the argument about, we could have a moral capitalism, friendly, all of that, it's not happening because of this. So this basically, it creates limits, on what capitalists are able to do. It's not as if they, they control the world and they can do whatever they want. No, they have to be, they behave in a certain way because of the imperatives of the system. And they are subject as well to those imperatives. And that was very different, obviously, in pre-capitalist society, when you have a production that is mainly undertaken for use value, because you don't have the same imperative. You're producing because, you're going to consume them. Obviously, there was some, luxurious goods and, things like that, but it was not, what dominated those pre-capitalist society. What really was there at the time was that you produce what you want to consume. So Marx said that the walls of the feudal lord's stomach set the limits to the exploitation of the peasant. But obviously in capitalism, you can reverse that all. There's no limit, to this cycle. There's no limit to the process of accumulation, because what you need is constantly to get to this M prime, and to get there, you need to sell your commodities. You need to get profit, and to do that, you need to obviously always be invested back into production. So it's really this element of competition that distinguishes a society based on commodity production and exchange value from where individuals decide on what use value to produce for their own consumption. Oh, perfect. Now the third part, the last big part of this meeting. So we've seen that competition is the driving force behind accumulation, and that makes capitalism a very dynamic system. It's constantly changing. It's a revolutionizing system. You see old industry are replaced by new industry. The face of the earth changes, well, not every 10 seconds, but it does changes a lot. And already in the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels wrote that the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relation of production, and with them the whole relation of society. So when you're asked, about the definition of capital, it's not just, just about the exploitation bit. It's also, about, the self-expansion of capital, the fact that it has to always grow. You always have, to look for this sum of expendable wealth. And that's why, this process of capital accumulation is crucial if you want to understand the dynamics of the system. Because on the one hand, it does explain the rapid expansion of the system, where you have, everything you can see around, and, to some extent, some of it is good, but not all of it. So it explains this rapid expansion, but on the other hand, he also explained the source of crisis. So Marx linked, what you see in this accumulation to the broader trend of capitalism, when he said that you have accumulation of wealth on the one hand, and poverty on the other. So what needs to be clear is that it's capitalists, by their own action, undermine their own profitability. So I'm going to go quickly, step by step, why that is. So once again, for capitalists, you always need, to get more wealth than you started with, and because of the pressure of competition, you're forced to always, put back some of your surplus value into your production process. And the thing is that the more efficient you become, the more, technological advances you're going to be using, and thereby the more you're going to be accumulating dead labor at the expense of living labor. So basically, in the first meeting it was said that only, the living labor produce this profit and this surplus value. So if you have, more of the dead labor and nothing in the living labor, well, surely, you're going to undermine your profitability. So this is, this paradox or contradiction, right? Is that the more efficient you become, what capitalists become, basically the less the commodities that they produce are worth. And you can see as well, how you have a lot of technological advances that would lead to lowering the price in the end. So for instance, if you were an industry that were using the advances in microprocessors, where you were able to produce DVDs, computers, etc. at a lower price. And then everybody was catching up, and that's why now you have, it's quite cheap if you look at what a phone costs now compared to 10 years ago, a computer, all of this, this is what it means. So Marx showed that, this exchange value is basically becomes less and less with, every time with technological advances. So basically in the long run, you'll have, you'll accumulate a lot more dead labor at the expense of living labor, and that will put pressure on your profit rates. So basically, the last bit, I'm going to be getting a little bit technical, but, it should be fine. So Marx is interested, in how much basically you use, those capital in proportion to another. And what he's going to show is that basically, the ratio of the amount that you use, of machinery over what you spend for your workers is gonna increase as you have technological advances. So there, if you recall, that was the organic composition of capital. It's just how basically a capital, how you use your capital. It's not more complicated than that. So the point is that, you know, the more you're going to become competitive, well, basically the more this ratio is gonna go up. So if you're good at math, it's quite straightforward. If you increase, you know, constant capital, and, you know, nothing happened in a way to viable capital, well, that means that this whole ratio goes up. Hopefully that's straightforward. So basically what Marx says is that, you know, this will increase over time. So you'll have more constant capital as opposed to like variable capital. And because you'll have that, you'll put a pressure on the profit rates. Because remember, like, okay, if I produce like, you know, my pair of jeans as like, you know, my great Levi's industry, the price, you know, that I sell this commodity for, it has to comprise a few things. So if you think about it, your price, you know, I'm gonna have to pay for my living labor. So your price of your final commodity, you're gonna have to pay for your variable capital. You also have to pay for this constant capital. We also need to make a profit, right? So you have, in Marxist terminology, so you have to also make a profit. And so from this, you get basically the formula of what the rate of profit is. Because you have to remember that for capitalists, like, it's not, you know, the amount of profit that you make that matters, but the amount in relation to the investment that you make, hence the rate of profit. So Marx. So the rate of profit, basically, Marx showed that it was the total amount of profit that you make over your total investment. So your variable capital and your constant capital. Okay, Marx doesn't use the V and the K there, but I find it easier. It will be S over V and C. That's what you will find if you read his writing. So that's basically the rate of profit. And it measures basically the rate of accumulation, the rate basically at which capital grows. And so what Marx basically said was that, you know, overall in the long term, you have a tendency for this rate of profit to fall, because you have also this tendency for the organic composition of capital to rise. So that rise, well, that falls. Once again, you use the ratio, you increase that bit, well, the whole decreases.
You mean the constant of dead labor causes the profit to fall?
I said that, well, anyway, there'll be time for question, I guess. I'm getting confused already. I said that because you increase the organic composition of capital, that means that it's translated in a rate of profit to fall. And that is because, you know, once again, from the first meeting you heard, you know, it's only this living labor that creates the wealth. So if you use a lot more, you know, machinery, etc., you fire workers, etc., well, at the end, you undermine, you know, you drive away, you drive out your sole source of profit. Obviously, capitalists don't know that, right? Like, if you read an economic textbook, that's not what you're being told. You're being told that, you know, you have two factors of production. You have capital and labor and capital. That's the same. But for mainstream economics, you know, both create wealth. Well, Marxist economics will show you that actually, no, it doesn't. And so that's why, you know, capitalists are not, they don't think, you know, ahead before they actually necessarily do that. And so it's basically such development that increase the pressure on the profit. And if you increase the pressure on the profit, you also, you know, have pressure on the rate of capital accumulation. So it's kind of a, you know, never-ending circle. And that leads to, you know, a pattern, well, of deepening crisis, you know, of overaccumulation, declining profitability, etc. And this is, I'm not going to get into much more of that because that's the topic of the next meeting, which will go deeper into, you know, what I've just explained now on what causes crisis. So I guess I'm going to sum up now, because otherwise the chair is going to shout at me. But basically, what you have to understand from this, it might be a little bit confusing, it's always a little bit confusing, but is that the process of capital accumulation is basically this, the most unique feature of capitalism as a mode of production. And it's crucial if you want to understand the dynamics of the system. So once again, the capitalists are under constant pressure to be reinvested, you know, surplus value back into production if they want to remain competitive. And that also means, you know, that this, accumulation process is limitless. This is very different, from like pre-capitalist society. That the movement of capital is limitless. You always, have to search for more wealth. And so that doesn't mean that, there can't be any problems, right? Like obviously it can crash, there could be like capital get destroyed and then recreated. Like it always changes, right? Like I'm not saying that there's never any objection to this circuit or whatever. But the point is that what you need to understand is that capitalism as a system is socially necessarily looking for surplus value. And so I'll finish by a quote that is, you will definitely see in Marx's writing, which really sums up, what a capitalist production is about. How new value is always created in order to be accumulated and put back into production. So Marx wrote that basically the capitalists are governed by this slogan: accumulate, accumulate, there is Moses and the prophets. Accumulation for the sake of accumulation, and production for the sake of production. That's it. Thanks.
Labor and constant capital there, dead capital or dead labor, it's no more constant, because with technological improvement, you find out like within the telecom industry, there's fast increase or decrease in technology, which brings in more production than the number of workers in that telecom industry. So I think that we need to review that perception of this is a constant capital, or that question of constant capital.
Simple, and it's basically just to try and clear this whole thing up in my mind. So basically, if we have three companies and they're all competing with each other, let's say they all employ cleaning staff. Okay. Now we know from the theory of use value that these companies are paying their staff less than the use value, and if I understood right, that means that they can derive profit from that. But if they all say pay their staff minimum wage, then actually they're all equal in that respect. And if they all derive the same profit, then really they've just fixed the market. Because if they're competing, then one of them will just actually, I'll get a little bit less profit and much more business. And that'll actually drive my profits higher, because for each bit of business I get say 2% profit. And if I get 1,000 times more than my competitor, that's actually all adds up. So if basically labour can be driven down the same in each business, how is labour actually any different to dead labour, if you like, in trying to get profit? Is it rather that profit is got from, for example, companies building up some sort of brilliant sales team, which they can outsell other companies by basically lying better to their customers?
Make it worse for the speaker by getting it wrong. So apologies in advance if I do that. Someone started off by asking about constant capital, and obviously within Marxist terminology it's totally different to, when I did economics and then I tried to study Marxist economics afterwards, the terminology is completely different. And they come at it from completely different angles, so it's quite difficult to get some of the words straight, and also when it gets translated from German as well, which is obviously what Marx was writing in. Constant capital is just to say, it's not saying, it means it's constant because the value of the constant capital stays within the product. So you've got the constant capital and then that transfers into the final product that then gets sold. So if you've got a piece of machinery that's making computers, after depreciation over the years go on, every time you make a new computer with that machinery, part of that original machine passes into that computer, and that's why it's called constant, because the same amount of value that goes into the constant capital gets transferred into the final product. I hope that's making sense. Whereas within labour, it's not like your employer doesn't pay you what your output is, they pay you the cost of you. And that's two totally different things. So the cost of a human being to make something is their education, it's how much food that costs to live on, clothing, etc., and your cost of living. But when you go to work, you make far more than the wages that you get paid. There's a gap, because you can produce far more than it actually costs to make you. and so there's a gap between the two, and then the extra value that you've just made goes into the profit bit, and that's why it's variable, because there's a variation between what you cost and what you actually make. I'm hoping that's making any sort of sense. Got
about a minute and a bit.
Right, so I just wanted to come back to those bits, and I think the point about Marx talking about capital wasn't that it was just looking at it morally. Obviously there's loads of, we can all come up with 1,000,001 different moral reasons as to why capitalism is a bad thing, from climate change to world wars, etc. But Marx is trying to actually understand the dynamics of the economy. I think, if somebody asked about the question about cooperatives, it's not that cooperatives are a bad thing, they're actually, for people to work in, and they're quite a good thing sometimes, but why aren't there more cooperatives? It's not an accident that there aren't more cooperatives around the place, and it's simply that if you've got a competitive environment and you're trying to make, if you're making computers in a cooperative and you're trying to make it ethically, so you don't want to pollute the planet and you want to treat your workers right and you want to have everyone have a good equal wage, and you don't want to make people redundant by buying in the latest machinery, well, over time you're going to become uncompetitive compared to some ruthless capitalist who does do that, who does bring in the latest machinery and make half their workforce redundant, and at the same time when there's mass unemployment says you're all going to take a 10% pay cut. And that's why the dynamic is more for capitalists to take over rather than people actually working cooperatively together in the current system. So I don't think it's a moral question around that, it's a question of actually cooperatives have always struggled to survive. I was trying to think on my way up here of an example of a large cooperative, and I can't think of one, and that's the real process of the dynamic of accumulation under capitalism, is that that drive for profit drives out the good and pushes in the bad system and all the problems that we see.
The question actually we had, which I'll try and answer, is what does this paradox really mean? If competition means that the more productive individual capitals are, how is it then that the value of what they produce falls? Because common sense would indicate that actually these capitals should become more profitable. They're more technologically sophisticated. Therefore, they should lay claim to a greater mass of surplus value. They are the leading. They lead their fields, and this is, I think, what is key to the logic of accumulation, because under these kinds of conditions, if an individual capital actually has a higher organic composition of capital, therefore a higher relationship of needs of production to wage labour, it's able to become larger. It overcomes its competitors. So this brings us to a central aspect of competition, which Marx talks about the concentration and centralisation of capital. Capitals become bigger. They become better organised. If you think about early industrialisation, you have whole circuits that link industrialisation in Britain with the slave trade, the sugar trade, cotton production, slave production in the Americas, but also the deindustrialization of Bengal, where you have a massive textile industry, and the deindustrialization of China later on. So from the creation of bigger and more centralized capitals, you actually have uneven development. So competition means that value goes into a smaller and smaller number of hands. So these bigger companies make particular regions of the world and particular countries more powerful. So already from this process of accumulation, when we move beyond the relationship between an individual capital and its individual wage labour and look at the system as a whole, we see bigger capitals and bigger countries swallowing smaller capitals and smaller countries. So we begin to understand how imperialism began to emerge and its circuits. So I mentioned the industrialization of Britain with the deindustrialization of India and of China, and their subordination to the British Empire and a cartel of countries in the case of China. And therefore we begin to see the mechanism of debt, how money actually flows to lubricate the system. So therefore, once capitals become so big that they dominate the national economy, then they begin actually to compete. Competition actually at the level of the national economy, there is a tendency towards its abolition, but only a tendency, because capitals still compete at the global level. So they have to then export capital. This is what Lenin sees this as the basis of imperialism. Yeah, sorry. So, in a way, I actually haven't answered my question because I've ended up, as if I was the speaker. But I was trying to look at actually the cycle of accumulation when you move to the relationship between capitals, and then one can, just to conclude, then one can actually go back to how the rate of profit falls, because these big capitals eventually find competitors. So once these people invest in the means of production, then prices will begin to go down and we enter into crisis. So this dynamism constantly finds itself as the barrier. It has to smash itself. Therefore, capital is fixed in particular areas, capitals rise and fall, regions of the world collapse like industrialization in Britain, and we have new rounds and crisis. Sorry.
Whether you think brand value at all plays into this equation that you're talking about? Like, I work for a pharmaceutical company, and in countries like India and China, like, we sell certain drugs which are exactly the same as the drugs sold by local manufacturers. But because it's a Western brand and people trust it more, people are willing to pay more for it. And it's not like, there's any change, they may be keeping the labor costs the same, like it may be, our brands may be produced in the same factory in India, but we still charge it a premium. And I was wondering, do you think some surplus value is maybe reinvested into advertising and marketing as well? And also, like, do you think people sort of screw the working classes, not just by keeping labor down, but also through marketing and advertising, pretending that they need stuff that they, showing them that they need stuff that they don't really need, sort of creating a desire almost. Thanks.
My question relates to issue of how capitalism can cope with growth. So you've talked about accumulation, and in a sense there's a feeling there's a constant growth of the economy. And yet, clearly one of the crises of capitalism hits points where, and I think Jack says it, you can have ceilings on growth. You can, for instance, run out of raw materials or labour or whatever. And in a sense, I suppose, my feeling is that we're going to hit a point where it's impossible. You can't have every country in the world trying to get rid of its deficit by all growing. It's just absolutely economically impossible. Therefore, there are going to be clearly moments when some capitalist societies will have no growth. And then the question is, what happens? Is that the crisis we'll talk in the next session?
Thank you. Well, I just wanted to come back on a few things. I haven't really got long, so I'll come back on two. Firstly, this question of the components getting cheaper, which I kind of vaguely understand was the way that it was phrased was about what happens here when the kind of components get cheaper, the constant capital decreases in value. I think that what we're saying here is that because of competition, that would drive down the price. You can't have a situation where components become cheaper, but that's not reflected in a drop of price because someone will reduce it. And I think that the other thing is about monopolies. Okay, it seems to be posing a kind of way of monopolies versus free market. What's the sort of best thing? And I think that neither of them are really. It's not about trying to choose one or the other. We're saying that the process of capitalist accumulation creates a situation where people tend to resist. And it's the workers' control, where people take over factories and workplaces themselves, that is the real alternative that we've got to look to. And our job is to try and explain exactly how this is, how this sort of thing is the motor force of what's driving things more and more towards destruction.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to come back on all of that. I have no idea how I'm going to come back on it right now. I have a lot of notes, so it won't be very organized, but I hope that answers at least some of the questions. Where to start? Well, first, okay, I'm going to take probably the question of like, why does this undermine, this whole rate of profit again? But this will be again, like, go to the next session because that should be a bit made more clear. But the main point is that what we're trying to show is that, you have, as a capitalist here, so you have two expenses, right? You have your variable capital and your constant capital, and that will create like your commodity. And because of the pressure of competition, you're going to have to be productive, to increase your efficiency. And the most effective way to do that is to invest into dead labor, in constant capital. And what there is again is because it's a machine, right? Like they're not people, right? So it's, well, you know, they won't protest, they won't go on strike, you know, they're not going to do any of that. Well, they're machines, and therefore, you know, the more you develop that, the more productive you'll be overall. But because in Marxist, you know, analysis, what he manages to show is that no, there is no like, you know, two factors of production as what you learn in mainstream economics. There's mainly one, right? Because even this dead labor, what is it called? You can think of it as past labor as well, right? It's like, you know, your machine, they didn't grow up, you know, like, you know, if you need like, you know, for my example of the pair of jeans, right? You need fabric and a sewing machine. But you know, the sewing machine didn't just come up, right? It's also was made again before with, you know, combination of certain living labor and dead labor. So this dead labor is past labor that is crystallized in the form of raw material and equipment means of production, but it doesn't create value itself, right? And hence, you know, the name as well of constant capital. It transfers the value, but it doesn't actually, you know, change the value. Hence, variable capital. It expands the value. But we know that capitalists are forced to do that, right? Because that's the most efficient way that they can, you know, make the firm productive and competitive. So they'll continue to do it. You know, they'll continue to constantly expand, you know, the amount of dead labor that they have at the expense of living labor. So the ratio of like how they, you know, they deal with like all this capital, this ratio is going to rise. That's the long-term, you know, tendency of what will happen. And that overall, you know, that will, you know, decrease your rate of profit. I hope that's a bit more clear. Then obviously, you know, the question that was raised about like, oh yeah, but you know, I mean, I'm not going to talk about the GDP, but it's true, you know, some profit rates, you know, we're going up and we're in a crisis, you know, surely that undermines. Okay, what Marx says is not that, you know, all the time the profits are going down. It's not, you know, I say it can go up, can go down in the short term, you know, like you can, you know, if you discover like a technology that, you know, allow you to be in advance, you know, to your competitors, yeah, and of course your profits are going to go up. But what will happen in the long term? But the competitors, you know, they're going to find out about this great technology and they're going to use it as well. And, you know, the more you do that, well, the less advantage you're going to have, basically, as, you know, there was the pioneer of like this great technology. So the long-term tendency is that, you know, the underlying tendency is that there is a rate of profit to fall. Of course, it can rise and go down periodically. That's fine, you know, but overall it will go down. And, you know, for example, yeah, like when we talk about growth and, you know, the idea that it's impossible, you know, to grow more. Like, yeah, obviously, you know, in the 60s and 70s, you know, there was, you know, the rate of profit, you know, fell. And, you know, what happened was that, yeah, there was maybe not productive growth per se, but what grew? The financial sector, right? That grew massively, right? So there's always a way that, you know, it might not be a productive growth, like, you know, with like material, etc., but you have a certain, you know, growth. Obviously, you know, it's not the same growth, and obviously Marx would say that, you know, it makes it even more unstable, right? Because, you know, the more you have a growth in the financial sector, for example, you have even more financial asset, you know, you're trying to not have this commodity part, right? You're trying to go from like this labor process, right? You're trying to go from like, you know, having a financial asset and turning it into, you know, more money. Money breeds money, you know, that's the idea. Well, Marx would say, oh, but no, that's wrong, you know, because actually you're trying to like bypass, you know, this labor process, but therefore you're bypassing as well, you know, what creates your profit, which is your living labor. So there's that as well. There's a meeting that you should go to by I think it's tomorrow, by Joseph Schooner on explaining the crisis this time, and that would definitely be dealt with in this session. Okay, now about the brands. Yeah, definitely, right? Like if you are, like even in the examples that I've used, you know, I use like brand name, and it's true, you know, like some brand, they because of their name, their image, and because like an iPod at first, right? Like I mean, you can sell it at a very high price because people will still go and buy it, right? But so yes, there's that, and you're totally right in what you said, that there's a lot of money that is being invested into this marketing, the publicity, and all of that. So yeah, like I guess you can think about it as like dead labor, but obviously there's a lot of money that goes into that would then, you know, you will be able to like charge a price, you know, higher than other competitors. Oh shit. So, but the point is that, you know, eventually in the end, you know, you're not, even, you know, when the first iPod, like, you know, came out, Apple and all of that, right? Like, at first, yeah, you could charge a very high price. But then what happened, you know? Well, you had Samsung that made the kind of iPhone, and then you had, you know, Nokia or whoever, right? And because of that, in the end, you know, the prices had to go down, even of the iPod. So even if you have a brand, you know, obviously you're not immune, let's say, to like the underlying laws of competition. Obviously, you might be able to take some advantage of it, but in the end, you'll be caught up on that. Yeah, there's a lot of questions, obviously, I haven't answered, which many of you are not going to be happy about. But I'll still comment on the idea that, I don't remember, but that, yeah, you know, it's, but thanks to competition, you know, computers get cheaper, and it's better for us, we can buy it. That's true, you know, I'm happy that the computer got cheaper, right? But like, I think we should not undermine, you know, the destructive, you know, aspect of capital, I mean, of the system, right, through this capital accumulation, because as much as, like, yes, some standard of living have risen, but what about, you know, all the others? Like, like as I said, you know, this capital accumulation, he explained the dynamics of it, he explained why you have, you know, this transformation of, you know, of the world and society and all the, you know, great things in a way that you find, you know, we see the advances, like all of that. Of course, you know, it's amazing. You know, Marx said that the bourgeoisie will, you know, they will show you, you know, what you can, you know, produce to some extent. But like, what about the distribution of it? You know, like, where is the equality? You know, what about, you know, that a fifth of like American children like still, you know, are brought up in poverty? What about, you know, the 2 billion people? No, I don't know. I think it's 2 billion, 40% of like, you know, the global population lives under $2 a day. Yeah, some standard of living, you know, have been rising, and that's true, you know, but we shouldn't undermine, you know, the continued poverty that there is, you know, and you can look at this country as well. Like, at the moment where it's happening, you know, with, you know, the cuts and, like, etc., like, it is literally killing people. Like, it's not, like, fool ourselves, right? And so, living in standard, yeah, you know, like, I think if you can afford it, then you're fine. If you can't, well, yeah, you're fine. And then, like, yeah, there's a lot of questions. I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer. No, I'm not able to answer. But the main point that you need to get is that this is, you know, the capitalist production contains in itself, you know, a lot of contradiction. And that doesn't mean that, you know, it will just, like, you know, go away like that and we can just wait and stuff. It means that, you know, if you want to end to exploitation, if you want to end to, like, if you want a world of, like, you know, where the environment is respected, where ethics are taken into account, then you need to change, you know, the way that the capitalist production is done, and this is not going to happen. This will necessitate, you know, like us to change the system, basically. And I'll stop here. Sorry about that.